So thank you. Yes, I'm going to talk to you today about the research that is I've sort of found my way into, which is biological research. We use physics to answer questions about biology, and I'll be talking about plant motion and more specifically the aerodynamics of seed and spore dispersal. But before I do, this is work that I could never imagine doing myself. It's very collaborative work. It's interdisciplinary, so it's almost necessarily collaborative. But first and foremost, I want to thank my students. This is just a few of the students who I've been working with, the most recent students that are in my team, and also students whose data I'll be presenting here. One of the things I do love about this work is that even a first year student who's just taking classical mechanics can start to make real contributions to it and understand the questions that we're asking. And then I'm not trained in biology. I think the last biology course I took was maybe 1986. So I lean a lot on biologists who I've collaborated with who really help me understand how to articulate the questions that are important to biology and then how to use the physics to address those. And then a number of institutions who've helped us throughout the way. Field station in Costa Rica, the National Science Foundation, who bought us some cameras. And I'm also really fortunate at Pomona to be right down the road from the California Botanic Garden, which is an amazing plant research center that's part of our Claremont College consortium. All right. So seed and spore dispersal. We're familiar with it. Even if we don't think we are, even if we don't think of ourselves as biologists, these are the primary ways that seeds, in this case, all seeds these are all seeds get dispersed. There is biotic dispersal, where maybe a bird would eat this fruit and then poop out the seeds somewhere else, and that's a great way for this plant, which can't move, to spread its seeds over a large distance. I won't be talking about biotic dispersal. That's firmly in the field of biology. But there is the role of fluids comes in if we talk about different types of dispersal. So one type of dispersal is to actually use the fluids to your advantage, right? So there might not be a fruit on the planet that's as good as coconuts at dispersing over a large distance, right? So a coconut grows in its coconut palm, it eventually ripens and falls off, and then it rolls into the ocean. And the ocean currents can carry it thousands of kilometers, where it rolls up on another beach and can sprout into a coconut tree. A little less far, but maybe more familiar, is dandelion pappus, right? This is a paper. This is from another paper from a different group who looked at the aerodynamics of the papae, which is the little white parts that when you blow on the dandelion fruit fly through the air. And you can see that they entrain this vortex ring behind them, and that gives them enormously high drag for their size, and the higher their drag, the slower they fall after they're blown off the plant, and the slower they fall, the further they can be carried by wind currents. So these can go maybe up to a kilometer. So really, the champions of, if you want to disperse your seeds really far, the best strategy to use is to actually use the wind or use other fluids to disperse your seeds. But surprisingly, or I don't know if it's surprising or not, but interestingly, there are a lot of plants that don't use the wind. And in fact, there's a number of plants. Here is a squirting cucumber, a frame from a video of squirting cucumber, where the plant themselves eject the seeds as projectiles at high speeds. And you really need two different strategies for these two dispersal mechanisms. There's amenochory, which is sort of wind-aided drag, and ballichory, which is ballistic launching of seeds. And here you've gone to great efforts to create a high launch velocity. You don't want drag to be sapping away all the energy that you've worked so hard to give these seeds. So here you'd want a high drag strategy where you want to stay aloft as long as possible. And here you'd want a low drag strategy. I'm going to mostly talk about these low drag strategies, but if there's time at the end, there is a plant I'd like to show you that kind of combines both of these strategies at once. Okay, so as Peter said, kind of the heart of our research is high-speed video photography or videography, I guess, where we use these high-speed digital cameras to record plants doing something fast. And then typically what we'll then do is look at the trajectories of these plants and try to understand the aerodynamics. That's where the focus of my research has been. And I just want to show you just kind of a collection of pretty cool videos that we and other people have taken of plants blowing. These are all well over 1,000 frames per second. In the top left here, we have Impatiens pallida. This was one I took at Williams. This grows down by the rivers. I imagine Eastern Washington has its own either Impatiens pallida or Impatiens capensis plants. They tend to grow near riverbanks and things like that. Ruellia megaclimus, maybe a less familiar plant. This is a tropical fruit. This is similar to one of the ones I'm going to talk about later on, just a little bit larger version. Wisteria is a non-native plant. Wisteria sinensis is it's a creeping vine that has beautiful purple flowers. A lot of people use it decoratively. If you have a wisteria vine, you may notice in the fall that it tends to explode and shoot its seeds after water gets on it. And then this is from a person I know in Germany, Simon Pappinga, and it's a witch hazel fruit. So you can see the witch hazel fruit shoots out its seed, and he's carefully marked this seed with a little white dot, which you see right there. And you see this actually travels like a spiraling football. And by spiraling, it can keep itself more aerodynamic, just like a football will go further with a spiral. This seed will travel further with a spiral. All right, so those are some interesting examples, but I want to focus now on one particular species of plant and talk about the fruits of it. So the species I want to talk about is Ruellia ciliata. It has sort of an unfortunate common name, which is the hairy flower wild petunia, but I've actually learned enough biology to try to avoid common names anyway. So this is a member of the Acanthaceae family. I might have time to talk about the Acanthaceae family a little bit later. It has pretty purple flowers. It's native to South America, but it grows pretty well in the southeastern United States and grows very well in the greenhouse at the University of Colorado, where Aaron Tripp took this photo. And what I want you to notice is that it has these fruits that stand up more or less straight and sitting above the leaves. And you can kind of see this seam on the fruit right here, such that if I crack it open, I see that the seeds are laid out inside, where each seed, a couple of them have fallen, but each seed is sort of cradled by this little hook right here. And also, you can, if you look carefully, you can see that this valve or the seam is not straight; it's curved. And all the time these fruits are ripening, this is drying out, it wants to be more and more curved, but the seeds are stuck together, so strains build up inside the tissue, and that's where the energy comes from to launch these seeds. So I'll just quickly go through that. So here's that same picture with a millimeter scale bar, but you can see these little hooks, which are called retinacula, if you want to talk like a biologist, are the things that do the launching of the seeds. And I don't know if you can see me, but what's going to happen is as the valves move outwards, the seed is going to roll off the tip of the hook. And if this is a hook moving to the right here, this seed is going to roll off, and it's going to roll off such that it has backspin, right? So it'll be traveling to the right, but in the picture that you see, it'll be rotating counterclockwise. All right, so here's a very beautiful video that we took of these fruits exploding. So this is recorded at 20,000 frames per second. To put that in perspective, this is slowed down by 700 times. This is ridiculously slowed down. And I just want to let us watch this together before I say anything about it. Okay, and if we were in person, I would probably ask people to make comments about this, but I think that's going to be a little too clumsy over Zoom. I will just run the video again, and I want to just point out a couple of things that I want you to notice from this. One, it's the fruits that are at the far end of the tip, or sorry, the seeds that are at the far end of the tip of the fruit that tend to fly the fastest. And the ones that are close to it, these are called the proximal seeds, they don't travel very far, they don't travel very well. And the really important thing to us that took us way too long to figure out is that these seeds up here are rotating with backspin, like I said, but then you remember that this video slowed down by about 700 times. They're rotating with an enormous amount of backspin. We calculated the fastest spinning ones to be going at about 1200 hertz to 1500 hertz, which is comparable to what a dentist told me is a not terribly expensive dentist drill, but still a dentist drill. So here's sort of a image from that. This is one of those like Olympic images where we show the seeds at different times. But these distal ones are spinners, we call them, and then these ones are floppers. The spinners travel much better than the floppers. They have a higher initial velocity, but they also travel really fast. We like this fruit because we can just dunk it in water, and that triggers it to explode within a few seconds. And what's extraordinary is these seeds, they're 2.5 millimeters across and about half a millimeter thick. So they're essentially like pieces of confetti, a little bit thicker than maybe hole punches, but smaller than hole punches in diameter by a long shot. So confetti, basically. And this plant can throw these confetti-like seeds 7 meters. with a launch velocity of 15 meters per second. I would challenge anyone in this room, I don't care how fast you can throw something, it's really hard to get a piece of confetti to travel 7 meters. So it's extraordinary physics that the plant is doing to get to elicit these launches. Uh, the other thing that we showed in this initial paper where we documented this is that backspin is actually the only stable orientation for a spinning disc. So we did that first by through experiment, I guess. We went to the supply closet and we found some CDs. And because our question was like, why wouldn't it throw it like a frisbee? A frisbee goes much faster if you throw it with side spin than if it goes with backspin. So we went to the closet, we got some CDs, we started throwing them, and we started to notice that unlike a frisbee, which has a lip, these symmetric discs, the discs without a lip, like a frisbee or a coaster, which I have here, and I don't know if you can see me or not. Maybe I can go back to showing myself here. So yeah, if you can see this, this is like a coaster. Well, it's not showing very well. At least, yeah, if I throw this sideways, it will eventually find its way to backspin. And we eventually showed that mathematically that it's a combination of the aerodynamic forces and gyroscopic properties of the spinning disk that make backspin the only stable orientation. So this then, raises the question of what's the adaptive significance of this? It's clearly going to great lengths to make these spin at really high rates of speed. They're spinning with very little wobble. It does look like the plant is trying to do this. What's the advantage for the plant evolutionarily to do this? And the first thing that jumps out at you is, well, if I am traveling with backspin and I'm moving this way, I'm going to present the smallest area, cross-sectional area as I fly through the air, right? I'm going to remain streamlined in a way that I'm not going to be tilted with respect to my motion, unlike the floppers, which are going like this. So we carefully in our first paper about this said that backspin, which is, the only stable orientation, minimizes the drag because it is the only orientation in which you create the minimal frontal area. But carefully, we did not say whether it maximizes the launch speed. So I think in the interest of time, I'm going to go kind of quickly through the assessment that we did for what the effect is on drag, but I do want to show this video. So if I zoom back out, we can start to look at the seeds. This is at 1,000 frames per second, I think now, maybe 2,000 frames per second. And we can start to track the position of the seeds as a function of time. And that's nice because, sorry, I'll go back to content only. That's nice because then once they're flying through the air, the forces are well known, right? There's the force of gravity, which is pointing down. We make sure there's a plumb line. I think you can see it right here. So we know which way gravity points. We have scale bars, so we can subtract that force out. And what we're left with are just the aerodynamic forces. And those are the force of drag, which is anti-parallel to the velocity, and the force of lift, which is going to be perpendicular to that.
Dwight, you're not sharing the correct screen right now. You see
Oh,
yours.
dear. All right. Let me see what I can do about that. Am I not sharing this one?
I think we see your desktop.
That's strange. How about that one?
Online Zoom, it's fine. We're seeing the video and everything.
Oh, okay.
Let me just hit share again. Maybe that works. How about that? Still bad? Let me stop sharing and just reshare. Maybe that'll work. How about
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good. Yeah, so we can track these seeds. I don't know where I got cut off, but we can track these seeds as a function of position. Once we subtract gravity, the only forces that are acting on them while they're flying are aerodynamic forces, and we can decompose those into lift and drag. We can quantify this. We can see that, the ballistic drag parameter, which is something like the drag coefficient, but it accounts for the weight of the seeds too, or the mass of the seeds too. We can plot as a function of the launch speed. And what you can see is that the faster launch seeds tend to be the ones that are spinning, which are the blue dots, and tend to have lower drag than the flopping seeds, which tend to be the ones that are launched more slowly and have higher drag. And there's a black line on this graph, and the black line is an interesting comparison. We estimated the volume of these seeds by measuring their mass and their density, and we considered a sphere of exactly the same mass Okay, so and mass and density. So if God instead had chosen to make these seeds little spheres, which, if you don't care about orientation, is about the most streamlined body you can make, and launch them with the same launch parameters, you can see that they actually have higher drag than these spinning seeds. So by flattening the seeds and aligning them to be in the small frontal area, you have improved the launch parameters. You've improved the ballistic drag parameter compared to a spherical seed. All right, and we can extrapolate that into projected launch distances. Um, Here is no drag. So you can see, these are still confetti. They're still very light. If they had no drag and were launched at 15 meters per second, they would go quite far. But we don't live in a vacuum, so this isn't going to be the case. The spinning seed, based on our drag parameters, we estimate this particular launch goes about 6.5 to 7 meters. That's in line with what we see in the lab. Compared to the sphere of the same volume and the same launching speed is only going to go a little over 4.5 meters. So you get about a 50% increase in launch range by making your seeds disc shaped and then making them spin compared to making them spherical. And you get a factor of 2 by spinning your flat seeds compared to letting them flop around. All right, so this was a really fun experiment for us to do. Now getting on to be about 7 years ago, I think. But it raised an important question, which is, yeah, backspin minimizes the drag, but does it maximize the range? And this is a much harder problem to answer because now we have to consider all the aerodynamic forces that are acting on a spinning disk as it flies through the air. So if I imagine that the disk is moving and it has, so here's the velocity of the disk and it has some pitch relative to that velocity, there will be an upwards torque there'll be lift due to that pitch, but there'll also be a torque on the disk due to that pitch. And since the disk is spinning and there's a torque on the disk, that torque is not going to cause the disk to sort of rotate up, but to precess around its angular momentum, around its velocity, and more gyroscopically start to precess. And now my attack angle has changed. So it becomes sort of a difficult differential equation, which we have pitch inducing a torque, torque inducing the roll of the disk because it's a gyroscope, the roll changing the orientation, this new orientation meaning a new pitch, which means you have to calculate another torque, and so on and so forth. This is exactly the kind of problem that appeals to Mathematica, and fortunately appealed to my student from 2021, Joe Hesse-Withbro. By far the best picture I could find of him, who was the one who was brave enough during the pandemic to say, yeah, I think I can solve that 5-coupled differential equations. So we model some aerodynamic forces, some aerodynamic torques. And what he did is he modeled or calculated what the trajectories would be for different launch parameters. So we're going to have different launch angles, which is just, how high above the horizontal you are, and different launch orientations where you'll have anywhere from side spin at 0 degrees to backspin at 90 degrees to the other side spin at 180 degrees. And he modeled these trajectories and we started to look at the ranges of them. I think time's getting a little bit tight, but I would like to go into this because I'm really impressed with what Joe did. Here, what you can see is these are all the trajectories modeled in sort of the 3D Mathematica output. And you can see that it is not backspin, which is right here, I think at 270 degrees, that maximizes the range. In fact, it's something at 60 degrees, 120 degrees, something actually closer to topspin, a little bit off of topspin, which maximizes the range because that's at some point in the flight as it's making its way to backspin, it experiences lift as an airfoil, and that lift can help you enhance the range. So this was a little surprising to us as amateur biologists to see that, there is a better solution, but nature didn't figure out this better solution in so much as if you think that maximizing the range is what the plant wants to do. To try to maybe understand these graphs a little bit more clearly, we can look at the dispersal range. That's just going to be the distance between where it was launched and where it landed, the x squared plus y squared distance, as a function of orientation, where again, backspin is at 270 degrees, topspin is at 90 degrees, and side spin's at 180 degrees. Okay, and you can see that, yeah, it's just a little bit past topspin here, where you get this 12-meter launches rather than the 7-meter launches that we are seeing in the lab. Okay, so this raises the question of why would a plant not figure this out? Evolution is a very efficient, well, if you have enough time, evolution is a very efficient way to solve problems. And it seems like if the problem the plant is trying to solve is how to launch its seeds further with lower energy, it seems like launching them with this topspin-ish orientation should be the one it should find. Well, it kind of depends. Here's our hypothesis anyway. That's an impossible question to answer definitively. But if you look more at the data, what you can see, and this is a complicated graph, so let me set it up for you. Here is the launch angle. This is just the angle with respect to vertical that this thing launches at. So 45 degrees would be the optimal launch angle for a projectile in vacuum. A little bit lower than that if you have to account for air drag. And this axis here is the launch orientation. So again, backspin, we're only showing half of it because it's symmetric around backspin. Backspin is here at 270 degrees. Topspin is here at 90 degrees. And the contours represent the launch distance for 3 different rotation rates, all within the parameters that we observe in the lab of these seeds. And what you can see is that, yeah, there is this sharp peak here where you can maximize the range, but it depends fairly sensitively on your rotation rate, right? So here it's at about 30 degrees and maybe 100 degrees of orientation angle. Then as we spin faster, the orientation angle that's optimal starts to creep up and you start to see this valley emerging to the left here. And then if we go even faster, the orientation angle has creeped up now to 135 degrees and the launch angle has sort of lowered itself down to about 20 degrees. So yes, there is an optimal solution to this, but that solution, it depends pretty sensitively on some things that would be hard for the plant to control. Particularly the spin rate and the launch angle that it has. So our hypothesis or our conclusion from this is that over here at backspin and at about 40 degrees of launch angle, you get a very robust, stable, pretty good launch. And that, I think, is what the plant is going for. So it's not trying to maybe maximize its launch at the peak of something like this, but instead find something that's pretty good and avoids these deep valleys over here, here, and here, so that none of its shots are useless. And in fact, it's already kind of hedging its bets with the floppers anyway. Okay, this is more of the same. It's just a different way to express that same idea. And I do think I'm running a little low on time, so I will try to move ahead. But this was an interesting thing, and I've actually been trying to bug biologists to help me with this question. It seems to me here that evolution has chosen a robust, good solution over a finely tuned optimal solution. At this point in the talk, I would love to give a familiar example of that from evolutionary biology, but I've yet to find one. I'm sure they're out there. I just don't think I've found one yet that I can share with you. I know I haven't found one yet that I can share with you, but then that's an invitation to anyone in the audience who has any ideas to please share it with me. Okay, so there we have the story of sort of Ruellia Flora. It has these fruits that are exquisitely designed or exquisitely evolved to launch seeds with high rates of backspin, and that high rate of backspin gives you a robust launch, which is better than a sphere, but not optimal, but robust. Okay. Next steps on this is we start to actually dress up as real biologists and start to do comparative biology. There are hundreds and hundreds of species of the Acanthaceae, and they almost all share this same explosive seed launch. But the variety of seed shapes and launching mechanisms is pretty amazing. So here's California native one. Its seeds look like little rugby balls. They don't spin with much backspin. They still kind of spin. It's hard to launch anything without some spin, but they don't seem to get any aerodynamic advantage from their spinning. There are other ones that are kind of hairy. There's other ones that are bumpy. There's definitely some aerodynamic advantages sometimes to having texture. What we're ramping up to do now with the help of biologists is to sort of look at how this behavior has emerged, particularly the low drag, high spin behavior amongst this clade of Acanthaceae. This has been data by Erin Tripp. She's gone ahead and sequenced the whole clade, and she knows the evolutionary tree. And here I have some stars showing you, different species that we've looked at in the lab. And you can see that this behavior gets passed around. It's easy for the plant to turn this on and off. And it'd be fun to see why, under what evolutionary circumstances, this behavior starts to emerge. I'll skip this graph because it's too hard. It just shows a bunch of different species, and you can see that this purple species is seem to do a little bit better in terms of lower drag and higher speed. So you might infer that this purple one is under higher evolutionary pressures to throw its seeds far than, say, the red ones down here, which don't seem to fly as well. So trying to put that together for the biologist is a really interesting and exciting time for me to kind of do, where I guess we could call this a phenotype, a dynamical phenotype, that we can then map onto the genetics and start to see how gene flow influenced the behavior of these plants. Okay, so now I'm going to indulge myself and talk a little bit about one of the cooler experiments that I've been involved in since I started doing this biology. So while we were researching the acanthaceae, we were, being good scientists and going to the library and reading papers about ballistic seeds and things. And the most famous ballistically launched seed, and probably still the most famous ballistically launched seed, comes from this tree. This is a Hira crepitans tree. It's a tropical hardwood. This picture was taken in or near Dominical, Costa Rica in 2019 when I was lucky enough to travel there with Jessie Ribera, who was a Pitzer student. She was a senior at the time. And that's the two of us. This tree is probably about 100 years old. This tree is now dead, I've learned. And it's this enormous tropical hardwood that has these really cool pumpkin-looking fruits. And they grow like upside down pumpkins. And in 1977, there was a paper published by Swain and Beer where they looked with a stroboscopic camera at the explosions of these fruits. So one of the common names for this tree is the dynamite tree. And it's called the dynamite tree because of the sound that the explosive fruits make. Okay, so when they dry out, eventually, again, stresses are building up inside the fruit. Eventually, the bonds that are holding together all the little valves of this fruit break, and it rapidly dehisces, is the fancy biology word for it, but it explodes and it launches its seeds a long way. And we were reading the paper, and here's the data. Here's the kind of data you could get in 1977. It's actually impressive data, but they didn't have the luxury of high-speed digital video cameras, so they used a strobe, right? So they use a strobe light. Here, the strobe light's flashing at 300 times a second, and you can see that they look at the trajectory of these seeds. And I want to just invite you to look at this picture right here. Here we have a seed traveling up to the left, and you can see they've put an arrow on it showing that this seed is spinning. So they recognized that the seeds were spinning, and they inferred, in fact, if we quote them, is supposed from carpal morphology. Sorry, I need to move something here. There we go. No. Can you still see it? Okay.
Yeah.
It exposed from carpal morphology in the photographs that the rotation is anti-clockwise, so that would mean counterclockwise here, for seeds viewed in flight from the left of the capsule. Translating that sentence, they inferred from how these things were launched or how they thought they were launched that they traveled with topspin. So, Jesse and I read this paper, Eric and I read this paper, and we said, well, topspin's not stable. That would be kind of impressive if these things could travel with topspin in sort of a metal stable orientation. Instead, maybe they didn't have a good enough camera at the time or a good enough time resolution that, in fact, they can't see that this is actually spinning backwards. So an example of that is if you watch car commercials on TV, sometimes it looks like the wheels are spinning backwards. And that's really just a convolution of the frame rate and the rotation rate of the wheels. So maybe it was just that these things are actually spinning backwards, but they appear to be spinning forwards. And they don't even say they appear to be, they just say they infer them to be spinning forwards. So this was all the impetus we needed to, not that you need much, to plan a trip to Costa Rica where we, through connections, found access to one of these trees and to bring our high-speed video cameras with us because it's easier to bring the cameras across borders than it is to bring biological material and record the launch of these fruits from this tree. So this is an incredibly lucky video. Jesse and I traveled there in 2019, and a friend of a friend of a friend had harvested some of these fruits in January during the dry season, saved them in a freezer for us, and we got one good video, which I'm going to show you right now. So here is the fruit the stalk is not on it, but this is oriented in the way that it would be oriented in the tree, and a heat gun, which is going to trigger this thing to explode. And I want you to watch, this is recorded at 2000 frames per second. And I want you to watch now this and tell me whether the seeds have topspin or backspin. So I invite you to actually just choose one seed. There's a lot of seeds. They go out radially. It's not as maybe photogenic as the previous plant that would all went in a plane, but just pick a seed, any seed, and tell me which way it's spinning. And I've watched this video enough time that I've checked every seed, and I can promise you they all are spinning with backspin. So this was really cool for us. Because here we have a plant. Now, here crepitans, just to talk like a biologist a little bit, is in the Euphorbiaceae family. The Euphorbiaceae family is different than the Acanthaceae family. So this means that this is nowhere even closely related to the plants I showed you before. Yet it's using the same mechanism to reduce the drag of its seeds and to launch its seeds with high rates of backspin, presumably to enhance the launch range. So this is biologists have a fancy word for when some trait has evolved not through the flow of genes. It wasn't passed down, but some trait evolves in different organisms, basically just under evolutionary pressures, and that's called convergent evolution. This one I do have examples of that should be familiar with you. Bats fly and birds fly. They are not closely related. Bats did not get the evolution of flight passed down on them from birds. They're, closely related to rats and mice and things like that. It just evolved because it was beneficial to bats. Armadillos and echidnas kind of look alike. Seals can swim and fish can swim. This is all sort of behavior that is evolutionarily advantageous, but has not been passed down. As a physicist, identifying and then documenting convergent evolution was a pretty cool moment in my life. But who doesn't love doing something twice? So I got to say, Pomona College is very generous with travel funding. And just last month, a new student, Athurva Kulkarni, and I traveled back to Costa Rica. These are actually the same two trees I showed you before. Like I said, this one is dead. You can't quite see, but it's chopped off at the top. And the questions that was lingering is like, one, we only had one video of these seeds. And two, they had been fruits that had been sitting in the freezer for a couple months before we saw them. So we were a little worried that we weren't really seeing the correct behavior. I think the backspin is unequivocal, but we weren't getting the same rates of speed that Swain and Beer were getting. We thought maybe the fruits were a little bit corrupted from sitting in the freezer. So ironically, we went back, we spent a whole week trying to, video record these seeds. We got a lot more fruits, but we were a little early in the season this time. So we only really had two viable specimens. And this is the only video we have of from our entire trip. But I do want you to just see that they go a little bit faster than they did in the last video. So this is 1,000 frames per second, but this thing is insanely powerful. So I guess the good news is we do see that putting them in the freezer wasn't great for these fruits and that they can go faster than that. The bad news is we only have one data point. The silver lining to that is that makes for a perfect excuse for us for more money to go back to Costa Rica next year. And hopefully the dry season will come a little bit earlier and cooperate with us. All right. So yeah, I guess I could summarize all this, and I have a little bit of time left, I think, but not much. So I may end here, but I may just show you one more thing. So summary of spinning seeds. A spinning disc with backspin has lower drag and longer range than an equivalently sized sphere, which is the best case for an object, the best drag case for an object with no preferred orientation. So if you can take a projectile and squash it into a disc shape and make it spin, it will go farther than if you leave it as a sphere. And we've seen this behavior now in widely different taxa, and we actually have some new taxa that we're going to be talking about, but it's top secret, so I can't tell you. But this aerodynamic property of the seeds may be determined. We're going to try to do some comparative biology as well, and try to use these aerodynamic drag properties of the seeds as a biological phenotype to see how evolution is driving these plants to launch their seeds farther. Because one of the things that sort of looms over all the research that I'm showing you today, or at least all the plants I've shown you so far, is physically, maybe from an engineering perspective, from a physics perspective, these are extraordinary plants. Like the engineering, it's a horrible term to use, the evolutionary design of these things, or how evolution has built these plants to launch spins with high rates of seeds and throw a piece of confetti 7 meters is extraordinary to me. But the dandelion is not impressed, right? If a dandelion could only disperse its seeds 7 meters, it wouldn't be nearly as successful as it is. So the whole the whole evolution of ballistic bellicory or ballistically launching its seeds is a strange one to me because it really can't be about trying to maximize range. Because if you want to maximize range, make a parachute, make a sail, make something that uses the wind. Yet there must be some advantage because it's evolved so much over so many different taxa to launch your seeds ballistically, and then once you've launched them ballistically to optimize the aerodynamics. But no one has really had a firm answer of why ballistic dispersal might be better than air aided dispersal or anemochory. All right. Actually, I'll check in with you. How much time do you think I have?
Oh, you can go 10 minutes.
Okay. Good. Okay, I'll try to share again then.
Yeah.
If I can. Dang it. Oh, share. Here we go. So the
That's
other one
first.
I want to talk about, and I can go quickly through this, is sphagnum moss. So sphagnum moss is one of my favorite plants, and this is one we're still actively studying as well. It's a moss, so it's a non-vascular plant. It grows in bogs. Actually, you're lucky up there in Washington State. Well, maybe not on the eastern side, but on the wetter side of Washington, there are peat bogs. If you ever get a chance to go to one, I would highly encourage it. But these are just vast fields of peat. In fact, peat bogs and sphagnum moss cover 1% of the land area on Earth. Most of it's, northern Canada, Russia, things like that. So not where people live, but it's in some ways the most successful land plant there is, right? It's covering 1% of the land area on Earth. It's found on 5 continents. It completely takes over ecosystems by lowering the pH and removing oxygen. It's the world's largest terrestrial carbon store. I should quantify that. And maybe most importantly, it gives Scotch whiskey its unique taste. All right. But this is interesting because while it's evolutionarily incredibly successful, it's surprising because it's a moss, right? Mosses differ from a lot of the plants, vascular plants that the angiosperms and things like that, grasses and trees and things like that. And one important way that they differ is they don't have plumbing. So there's no xylem and phloem in a moss, so they can't grow tall. That's why mosses don't grow as tall as grasses or trees, because there's no way to pump the water up. So they can maybe grow an inch or so in height. And they're primitive sort of genetically as well. They only have one copy of each gene. So they don't have backup genes. If there's a mutation or something like that, they're going to be more sensitive to it. And these were primitive plants were mosses. Yet sphagnum is a new moss. It's only about, I think, 14 million years old. The oldest mosses are 500 million years old. So somehow this primitive plant emerged only 14 million years ago when there were already vascular plants that can grow tall and shade it out, and have evolved, for longer periods of time than the mosses, and just dominated ecosystems, and pretty much took over, a good part of the terrestrial world. Through evolutionary competition. And so I'm going to show you, this is a field site. This is going to be some data that we took back when I was at Williams, actually this a return trip to Williams, but near Williams College, at a bog. And I want to just show you something that's unique to sphagnum moss. Now, I can't say certainly that this is why sphagnum moss is successful, but I've certainly hinted that. These are the spores. Okay, so in the summer, around maybe late July, early August, from the mat of sphagnum, which is this vegetative part, these spore capsules will emerge on top of these little pedestals. And inside here is going to be some mucousy stuff and some spores, but eventually it dries out and it's left with just gas as spores. And then On a warm day, so here's a close-up of one of these spore capsules. This is a millimeter, so it's about the size of a peppercorn. Um, it starts to shrink because what's happening is it grew too tall, and now there's no water here. So this whole capsule starts to dehydrate and it goes from spherical to cylindrical. And then in the very last frame of that 1 minute time lapse, you can see that the cap, it blew its top. Okay. And that's the part that was interesting to us. So here I'm going to zoom in time on that cap blowing off. So here's a video recorded at 10,000 frames per second, and I will play it. And you get this ejection of the spores by the pressurized gas inside. And if you look again at this video, in fact, I'll show you maybe a better video. There's another 11,000 frame per second video of another capsule. You see the distinctive mushroom cloud that emerges. And a mushroom cloud, if you've done any fluid mechanics, you would recognize as the sign of a vortex ring. So what's going on with this plant is it uses pressurized gas inside here, and it blows its top, and it emerges with this vortex ring. So vortex ring, here's what the flow field of a vortex ring looks like. I have a demonstration, but I don't think I'm brave enough to try to pull that off over Zoom. It is, if you've known a smoker who can blow smoke rings, that's a vortex ring. It's a toroidal flow where the fluid is sort of going around in this little circle around a donut where it comes up to the middle of the donut, goes across the frosting, and then back up again and circulates. And if you can get the fluid to circulate in this kind of manner, the center of mass of this vortex ring has no choice but to move forward. In fact, there's a force on each side of this from itself, and it starts to move, and it moves with incredibly low drag. So this is an interesting problem. So this plant, right, remember it's a non-vascular plant. It can grow maybe an inch tall at best, wants to disperse its spores with wind. Like here's an SEM of the spores. That's 20 microns. This is maybe 35 microns across. This is a grain of dust or a mote of dust, easily carried by the wind. Terminal velocity, 4 millimeters a second, maybe even lower than 4 millimeters a second. So the slightest updraft will keep this in the air forever. But there is no wind down on the forest floor. If you look at the atmosphere is a fluid that has to obey boundary conditions. The boundary condition is going to be that the velocity at the boundary, which is the forest floor in this case, is going to be zero. And it's not till you get, rule of thumb, about 10 to 15 centimeters above the forest floor that you start to actually get air currents that will mix the lower atmosphere with the upper atmosphere. So you need to get your spores from the ground up 10, 15 centimeters in the air. And that's no problem for an oak tree, right? Because the oak tree will just drop its spores from its flowers, its pollen from its flowers at a high height. And, maybe that gives you hay fever. Maybe a grass, which can grow, a couple meters tall and then flower, that's going to have no trouble getting its pollen into the wind. And you notice that pollen in the wind if you have allergies. But this poor moss can't grow tall enough to do that. So instead, what it did is it came up with this really clever idea to use a vortex ring to propel its spores up through drag, right? By creating its own airflow or fluid flow. This fluid drags the spores up, and I'll show you the video again. They go a good 10 to 15 centimeters before the vortex ring eventually dissipates, and then they can be carried by the air, and they can travel thousands of kilometers. In fact, all around the world, they can get into the jet stream, and then they can colonize pretty much anywhere. And that's why we have bogs all across the world. All right, so I'm going to stop there. Thanks so much for your attention.